Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. I'm here today to review A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I know that this book has maybe been done to death at this point on BookTube. It seems like everybody has had really strong opinions on this book. Most people, it seems like, really love it, although there have been reviews that I have seen of people who were not impressed at all by the writing style and the way that Hanya Yanagihara talks about trauma. So I kind of wanted to jump into that conversation. I don't know that I will have anything like radically new to say, but I did have some thoughts on how she was developing the trauma in the story, and I actually think that we should step back from the narrative elements of the book and look at it as an aesthetic experiment. So I kind of wanted to talk about how I was approaching the book in that way and how that maybe redeems some of the qualities that negative reviewers have been having so much trouble with. I'm not trying to say that those negative reviews aren't completely justified though, and I think that some of them have been really helpful to me in sort of trying to solidify my own ideas about the book. In some ways, I think that maybe I just really enjoyed the reading experience of reading A Little Life, and so I'm trying to find the redeeming qualities of the book, even though that I know that some people have interpreted those same qualities as real drawbacks to the book. So anyway, this is a kind of a experiment that I am undertaking of my own in trying to kind of pick apart maybe why people have responded so well to this book popularly and what I think about it. So the two different camps of reviews that I have seen are completely split on how Yanagihara is representing trauma. One side felt like it was really emotional and they just found so much to love in these characters and the way the characters were developed that they were just devastated by the end of the book. Another camp felt really manipulated by the way that she was using trauma to kind of force people to have an emotional reaction. And I think the book makes room for both perspectives. I think that that is why people are responding to it so strongly, because it contains the emotionally manipulative elements and it contains the ways that characters are constituted by trauma in ways that people felt was very realistic and relatable. And I think that's because the force of the novel is not actually in the narrative elements and plot, but the book is actually about the experience of reading the book and the experience of reading trauma. Okay, so I'm going to give a little synopsis of A Little Life, but I don't want to give away too much information because I think the real force of reading it is being surprised, and I think that that is supposed to be part of the experience of reading the book. So if you haven't read it, it's probably best not to know anything about it going in. The few things that I knew was that it was about a group of very close friends who meet in college, and one of the friends, his name is Jude, had experienced something in his past that was extremely traumatic and that affected the rest of his life. That's all I knew going into it, and I think that that made for a really interesting reading experience. I might talk a little bit more about what Jude underwent as a child, but I'm going to try not to spoil anything. Still, I would say that if you haven't read this and you are interested in reading it, then I maybe would not watch this full review. That hurts me to say because I want people to watch all of my videos because I am brilliant and I have so much to say about everything, but you know, I will take the hit. You can turn off my video if you haven't read it. I think that one of the reasons that people feel like this book is quite unrealistic in the way that it depicts a childhood full of trauma is because it occupies this strange space between realism and fantasy. In some ways, the character development seems entirely realistic, and there is no sort of fantastical, mythical elements going on that makes that obvious, but there is a just overwhelming amount of bad stuff that can happen to one person that makes people think that, oh, this is just like ridiculous. This couldn't possibly happen to one person. And I actually think that that is a completely valid point of view. It really is hard to believe that this many bad things could happen to one person, but I think that that's kind of the point. When people say that the book is kind of like trauma porn, I've heard people throw that term around, that it's trauma porn. I actually completely agree with that, and I loved this book. So it's weird that I can say, yeah, I think it's trauma porn, but I actually think that it is meant to be pornographic in that way, and it's meant to challenge our desires as readers to keep reading. I think that the book is almost a disrobing of its main character. You don't know what's happened to him in the beginning, but you really really want to know. You have this real desire as you're reading to hear about all of the horrible things that he has undergone. From the beginning, you know something terrible has happened to Jude, and as the book continues, it's an unveiling of Jude that you are excited about and that you participate in by continuing reading. And I don't think that that's our fault as readers. I don't think that's a condemnation of what we desire when we read, and I think Hana Yanagihara is very conscious of the fact that that's how people read. Part of the joy of reading is to feel shock and to feel disgusted and all of these really strong aesthetic responses. Yes, part of it is to feel love and empathy and all of those things, but people read horror and people read about trauma and people read realistic fiction not just to kind of learn about their world. I think that they do it because they enjoy it, and I think Hana Yanagihara knows that. So she keeps insisting as the book goes on that we are never going to know Jude's full character until we know about the trauma that he has undergone. Therefore, the book makes this claim that Jude is constituted by his trauma. So I've heard people talk about how they feel like Jude is not a fully represented character because all we know about Jude is that he hates himself and he underwent these horrible experiences. And I agree that that is not necessarily a realistic portrayal of a character, but it is a realistic portrayal of a character in a novel, if that makes sense. People who are novelistic can be constituted by the trauma that they've experienced in a novel. And I think our desire to hear about Jude's horrible experiences is articulated through the other characters talking about Jude and talking to Jude. When all of his friends are trying to pull out the information about his past out of Jude, we want them to succeed. We want to hear about all of the things that they want to hear about because we know that we will never understand Jude as a character until we understand that trauma that forges his personality. Here is a short excerpt, doesn't give anything away, that says, "I knew nothing good lay behind his silence, and as much as I didn't want to hear what the story was, I wanted to hear it as well." I think that is a direct comment on how we are reading the book too. And earlier in the book, that same character is talking about how he experiences pain, and he's talking about the term heartbreaking, and he says, "I had always thought it mawkish, but in that moment I realized that it might have been mawkish, but it was also true." And I think that that's another comment of the book, is that just because something is overwrought and over the top and not realistic and pretty fantastical that this person could ever experience this horrible series of events, he's always trapped in a traumatic series of events that he can never escape from. Yes, maybe that's mawkish, but that doesn't mean that the pain that comes from it is not true. I think that all the trauma and the emotions of the book were unrealistic because they were all racketed up to give a really clear representation of what trauma can do for both characters and the people listening to the trauma. Like, I think that this book is more about us reading the trauma than it is about Jude experiencing the trauma. And in that way, I think that it's really important that these are all male characters told from a female perspective. And from what I can tell, I don't want to stereotype, but it does seem like a lot of women are responding to this book and reading this book the way that women usually do read more fiction than men do. I've heard complaints that there aren't women characters in the novel, but I think that that's part of the fantasy-scape, that no women can penetrate to use the pun, no women can penetrate this world of masculine trauma because we are used to seeing women as victims in novels, and we're used to seeing women as victims in real life, frankly, and that we have social systems set up to deal with, and I want to use this neutral term deal with because I do feel like there are ulterior motives a lot of the time, but we have these systems set up to deal with women's trauma, and the way that we deal with male trauma is usually to just try to ignore it and get rid of it. So I'm not like advocating any sort of like men's rights movement. I think that feminism offers answers to both of those problems, but I think that her point from a female perspective was to explore what it would be like if a man was fully constituted by the act of being a victim. There's this great TED Talk by this man named Katz. I can't remember his first name right now, but I will link it down below. And he does this great exercise where he's talking about how passive voice can turn women into a victim as their identity. So he talks about how the sentence starts off, John beats Mary, and then it's Mary was beaten by John, and then in the end it turns out that Mary is a battered woman, and John has completely been removed from that equation. Her entire identity has become her victimhood, and I think that Hana Yanagihara turns that around in this book and says, what would happen if a man's entire identity was created by the trauma? So in that way, I think that everything in the book turns on the abuse that he undergoes, not just for Jude, but also for every other character in his life. And in that way, it is a deeply pessimistic book. I've heard people talk about how, you know, it's a representation of how friendship and love can help someone overcome hard times in their life, and I didn't see that at all. Again, not to spoil anything, but to me it felt like very deterministic. Jude seems like he will always be constituted by that trauma, because what else is there? There's nothing outside of the abuse in Jude's life that if you got rid of the abuse and you had him deal with the abuse, then there's just a deep hole in Jude. He doesn't have anything to fill that with. Everything that he enjoys and loves is just a way of dealing with his own abuse. So in that way, this novel seemed very cynical to me, and again, sadly realistic in that sense, in a way that maybe the plot points aren't realistic, but the psychology of the experiment was realistic for both the characters and the readers. I felt like I just rambled forever about A Little Life, and I hope that I can now take this video and edit it into something that makes even a little bit of sense. This is just what I was thinking about when I was reading the novel. I found a lot of instances of people talking about what it's like to hear about trauma at the same time as I found people talking about what it's like to experience trauma. So I just felt like the book was calling attention to itself in that way. But, you know, I would love to hear what you have to say. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me. This is a really controversial novel, it seems like, and part of that probably is just as a reaction to how popular it has been and how much it has been talked about in bookish venues. That might be part of it, but I also think there is something a little bit condemning about the reader when you read this book that makes you either want to justify why you love it, or it makes you want to hate it and justify why you hate it. It like calls for justification of your own aesthetic response to the book. And in that way, I think that it's brilliant. Whether or not you like it, whether or not you enjoyed reading it, I do think it makes a lot of interesting comments in why we read and how we read. So once again, that was A Little Life by Hana Yanagihara, and let me know if you've read it, you probably have, and what your thoughts were.